I've always loved Scripps campus. It's so beautiful, isn't it? And there's always a little tranquil corner you can find when you need some peace. But what I really love is the warmth of our community. Really, the only complaint I have about the place is that sometimes it gets a little sleepy. Next slide, please. And that's probably why about once a week I find myself in a place like this. In my other life as a neuropsychologist working with older adults for social services in Riverside and San Bernardino County. I've been assisting on elder fraud and elder abuse cases in Southern California for about 10 years. And I've really gotten to know the desert retirement communities very well. Next slide. It's in this role that I've met people like my client, I'll call Helen. Helen was on the hook. Helen, an 85-year-old widow, had been a victim of sweepstakes scams for about a year. Our team estimated she had lost about $100,000, but we couldn't be sure of the total. I drove out to her home out in the desert, and even though it was early in the day, the temperature was already pushing about 100 degrees. But Helen didn't have air conditioning. She didn't have much food either. Helen was a chronic compliance scam victim who at this point in time was spending more money on scams and didn't have enough for basic necessities. When I looked at my notes, my case referral informed me that Helen had been a widow for a couple of years. I asked her about her experience, and she seemed overwhelmed. She said, looking around at all the mail piled on every surface in her home, "Where did this come from? How did this start?" She admitted to me that she liked talking to the scammers at first. She enjoyed the attention. But she said soon their tone changed, and she said, "I don't have anything else. There's nothing for them to take." She even seemed nervous that we were out there visiting her and asked us to move our county car, feeling that she was being watched. I asked Helen a little bit more about the type of mail she was receiving, and she handed me a flyer that I quickly identified as a classic affinity scam. You know the type? It says something like Brothers for Veterans and has pictures of World War II vets on it. That might not work very well on you guys, but on Helen, whose husband George had served proudly in the US Navy, this was a big pull for her. She had pictures of George on the wall, and she really couldn't discriminate between legitimate and illegitimate offers. And before we judge Helen, I just want to note in the New York Times today, there was an article on people's ability to judge legitimate versus illegitimate Facebook stories. So take the quiz in the New York Times and see how you guys do. Next slide, please. So I'd drive back to campus and I'd be thinking about my clients and mulling over the case, trying to think about next steps. I mean, Helen was sort of a puzzle to me. She didn't have dementia. A lot of my clients do. No history of mental illness. Helen had made good financial decisions in the past. What made her vulnerable at this point in her life? What were the tactics that the perpetrators were using to get her on the hook? But for the most part, I was trying to keep my lives separate. Back at the Neuropsychology of Decision-Making lab, we were doing traditional studies of aging and decision-making on legitimate topics. For example, do older adults rely more on heuristics than younger adults? But I'd often be processing what I was seeing in the field, and my students loved hearing about it. And they soon shared my fascination for the what, how tactics that were being employed on my clients, and would spontaneously propose research studies to get at it. But I warned them. There's no psychology of scams field. There's no psychology of scams journals, conferences, and most importantly, there's no APA division on scams or fraud. But you know what? My students didn't know that, and they didn't care. And fortunately for me, I work here, and I have tenure. So I thought, why not? And tackling a topic that requires an interdisciplinary approach, that addresses an important social problem, that differentially impacts vulnerable populations, was in fact a perfect fit for Scripps values. So we got started. Next slide. These are some ideas that we came up with through a lot of brainstorming sessions over the last 5 years or so. Ben Rockala kind of got us started. He was a Pitzer student, and he worked with me as an intern actually out in the field one summer. And based on those experiences, we wrote a paper on interviewing substantiated fraud victims on their experience. We also had an ambitious project where we followed individuals over time. So we thought, what if we could identify Helen but go back in time a year or two? Could we see red flags? Could we put something into place so that she didn't become a victim? That project involved a number of Scripps students over many years, including Sarah Williams, Nina Pierce, Carolyn Joyce, Carolyn Davis, Laurel Katata, and many others. Warren Selznick had the idea of actually calling the number on scam letters. This one I don't recommend. Within a couple of days, he was being offered a trip to London to pick up an inheritance he hadn't really known about. So I wouldn't do that one. Assessing individuals in high versus low risk areas. So unfortunately, older adults in immigrant communities are targeted even more frequently, often because they're less likely to report being a victim. Reverse engineer the scam process. This one is an ongoing project I'll say a few more things about in a minute. And why not just create our own conference, right? We're going to make our own conference focusing on fraud, so we're working on that now. Next slide. So this image shows some of the scam letters that have been confiscated by the Postal Inspector's Office. Maybe you didn't know that there is a law enforcement part of the Postal Service, but they're very interested in stopping these types of solicitations reaching consumers. They know I'm interested in the topic, so they've donated hundreds of these letters to my lab. I probably have 500 in my office. Yeah, they're a lot of fun to read, if you're ever interested. Next slide, please. So what we actually did with the letters, besides read them, is we conducted a content analysis so we could identify common tactics that the scammers are using. And these confiscated letters were successful. So these are letters that are working. Some people are responding to them. By creating our own mock-ups, we were able to also experimentally manipulate different elements of the letter. In this example, what we manipulated was what we're calling hot and cold. So we have a cold, low emotion, business type letter, and then one where we added images and color and made the reward or the check more salient. And those winners are actually family members of lab members on vacation. So we hypothesized that consumers, especially older consumers, would be more drawn to the hot solicitation, and we were seeing a lot of these tactics out in the field. What do you think we found? We found the opposite. Yeah, because consumers thought that looked too scammy. And if you're getting scam emails, you'll notice they often look very businesslike. And this, yet again, the scammers are always 2 steps ahead of me. Next slide. So I'm happy to say that we recently published a paper in 2018 in one of the most traditional, stodgiest psychology journals out there, JEP, the Journal of Experimental Psychology Applied, with many more in process. But more importantly, I've been able to take what we're learning in the lab back out with me into the field. We've developed trainings based on some of the knowledge, so we're providing those to people on the front lines. So while I truly hope you enjoy your year here at Scripps, I also hope that you have a chance to get out into the community and then bring what you're learning there back here to inform our work. I think you'll see that it makes this place a lot more interesting. Thank you.